Preface. Victor Davis Hanson opens the case for Trump by stating the purpose of the book directly. He wants to explain why Donald Trump won the 2016 presidential election, why nearly 63 million Americans supported him, and why his opponents came to despise him rather than merely disagree with him. Hanson does not present the book as a biography or an inside account of the campaign. He presents it as an interpretation of a political phenomenon, the convergence of an unconventional candidate, a dissatisfied electorate, two weakened political parties, and an entrenched administrative and cultural establishment. Hanson's argument begins with Trump's status as an outsider. Trump was the first American president elected without prior political or military service. Conventional observers treated this absence of experience as a disabling weakness. Many voters treated it as evidence that he had not yet been absorbed by the political system they distrusted. His wealth, celebrity, and relative freedom from donors allowed him to ignore conventions that constrained ordinary candidates. He could insult influential people, reject established positions, and threaten to dismantle institutions without fearing the usual loss of elite approval. The author repeatedly distinguishes approval of Trump's behavior from support for his political function. Many of Trump's voters did not consider his language admirable. They nevertheless welcomed his willingness to confront people and institutions that, in their view, had ignored or mocked them. His uncouthness became a form of political catharsis. Where professional politicians used qualified language, negotiated around controversial questions, and avoided offending powerful constituencies, Trump spoke in blunt and sometimes reckless terms. His supporters saw this as an attack on what Hanson describes as the doublespeak of modern politics. The book situates Trumpism within the economic and cultural decline of the American interior. Hanson argues that the industrial and rural regions between the two coasts had been treated as obsolete remnants of an earlier economy. Globalization enriched metropolitan centers connected to finance, technology, education, media, and international commerce. It also exposed manufacturing workers, small towns, and traditional industries to foreign competition, plant closures, wage stagnation, and cultural marginalization. Trump rejected the assumption that these regions were destined to decline. He promised that their industries and political influence could be restored. The 2016 election was also a choice between two deeply unpopular candidates. Hanson does not conceal Trump's history of bankruptcies, failed ventures, lawsuits, sexual scandals, public feuds, and crude speech. He argues, however, that voters interpreted Trump's misconduct as the private behavior of a businessman and celebrity. Hillary Clinton's controversies were associated with public office, political power, government secrecy, and the accumulation of wealth through proximity to the presidency. In Hanson's formulation, many voters preferred the authentic bad boy of private enterprise to what they regarded as the insincere representative of the political establishment. Trump also appeared as an alternative to both parties. The Democratic Party had moved toward identity politics, larger government, higher taxes, expansive social programs, stricter environmental regulation, and more permissive immigration policies. Hanson argues that its leading figures increasingly combined material concern for the poor with cultural disdain for the working and lower middle classes. The Republican establishment offered a different but equally unsatisfactory orthodoxy: free trade without sufficient concern for reciprocity, tolerance of illegal immigration to provide low-cost labor, repeated military interventions abroad, indifference to chronic trade and budget deficits, and an assumption that the United States could indefinitely finance the international order. The author therefore treats Trump as both a symptom and a corrective. He was made possible by the failures of the political system, but he also attempted to change it. Hanson argues that Trump's first 2 years produced a stronger economy through tax reductions, deregulation, energy development, and greater confidence in American production. Abroad, Trump challenged allies that contributed too little to their defense, competitors that benefited from asymmetric trade, and adversaries that had learned to exploit predictable American policies. These judgments are presented from the perspective available when the manuscript was completed near the end of 2018. The book is organized around several questions. What social and economic divisions created a constituency for Trump? What policies transformed dissatisfaction into a winning coalition? Why could no conventional Republican candidate adopt the same agenda successfully? Why did the Democratic Party, the Republican establishment, the media, and the permanent bureaucracy respond with such hostility? And finally, could a president with serious personal defects nevertheless govern effectively? Hanson acknowledges his own position. He is a conservative, a fifth-generation farmer from California's Central Valley, and a voter who supported Trump in the general election. He says he has never met Trump, worked for his campaign, visited his White House, or sought an appointment in his administration. His purpose is not to portray Trump as either a demon or a deity. It is to argue that Trump's rise was intelligible, that much of his agenda answered real failures, and that the intensity of the opposition often concealed the substance of his record. Introduction. Meet Donald J. Trump. The introduction begins with Trump's campaign announcement on June 16, 2015. The setting was Trump Tower in Manhattan, where the celebrity businessman descended an escalator and entered politics without apologizing for his lack of political experience. From the beginning, he presented himself as an insurgent crossing into territory controlled by professional politicians, donors, consultants, and journalists. Trump claimed that his wealth made him independent. He would use his own money, avoid lobbyists, and refuse to tailor his message to donors. In practice, Hillary Clinton raised and spent far more than he did, while Trump benefited from extraordinary amounts of free media coverage. News organizations expected his candidacy to damage the Republican Party and improve their ratings. Their fascination with his provocations helped make him the central figure of the campaign. His opening message contained the themes that would define Trumpism. He accused China and other trading partners of exploiting the United States. He argued that Mexico benefited from illegal immigration and from the remittances sent home by workers living in America. He promised to restore manufacturing, secure the border, renegotiate trade agreements, avoid unnecessary wars, and make the country respected again. These positions did not fit neatly within the Republican establishment. Trump had previously supported liberal causes, and his economic nationalism conflicted with orthodox conservative support for free trade. The phrase, "Make America Great Again," contained a simple theory of national decline. America had once been great, had been badly managed by its leaders, and could recover through confidence, negotiation, production, military strength, and political will. Hanson emphasizes that Trump's diagnosis was not fatalistic. Decline was a choice produced by poor leadership, not an irreversible historical process. The same country could reverse course by changing its policies and its governing class. Trump also attacked the bipartisan foreign policy establishment. He argued that the wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and Syria had imposed great costs without producing clear victories. Institutions such as NATO, the United Nations, and the North American Free Trade Agreement could no longer be treated as sacred. They had to justify themselves according to American interests. This was not traditional isolationism. Trump promised to use force when necessary, but he opposed open-ended interventions that lacked attainable objectives. The Republican establishment reacted with particular hostility. Conservative intellectuals doubted Trump's ideological consistency, disliked his manner, and recognized that his success threatened their influence. The Trump administration would not necessarily rely on the usual network of Washington policy specialists and commentators. He was campaigning not only against Democratic policies, but also against the assumptions of Republican leaders who had supported free trade, permissive immigration, and repeated foreign interventions. Hanson argues that the polls underestimated Trump partly because some supporters concealed their preference. Conservative voters knew that supporting him could invite social criticism. Centrists and some traditional Democrats also hesitated to admit that they opposed the increasingly progressive direction of the Democratic Party. This hidden resistance to both elite culture and progressive politics produced a constituency that journalists and pollsters did not fully perceive. The author calls Trump an unlikely middle-class populist. He was a billionaire from Manhattan, but he spoke to voters who believed that institutions no longer represented them. His appeal did not depend on personal similarity. It depended on the claim that he would use wealth, fame, aggression, and independence on behalf of people with far less power. Hanson's task in the chapters that follow is to explain how that improbable relationship became politically effective. Part 1. What and who created Trump? Chapter 1. The Two Americas. Hanson argues that the decisive American division was not simply between the rich and the poor. It was an increasingly comprehensive separation between two economic, geographic, and cultural worlds. One America was concentrated in coastal metropolitan regions, connected to global finance, technology, media, universities, government, and professional services. The other was located more heavily in the interior, in rural communities, small towns, older industrial cities, and regions dependent on manufacturing, agriculture, energy, and physical labor. The author compares this division to older tensions between maritime, cosmopolitan societies and inward-looking agricultural communities. The analogy is deliberately broad. The point is that Americans were sorting themselves into territories with different economies, institutions, habits, values, and political identities. This geographical polarization mattered because presidents are elected through the Electoral College rather than a single national popular vote. Trump understood that votes concentrated in safely democratic coastal states had limited marginal value. A small movement of voters in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin could determine the presidency. He won those three states by a combined margin of roughly 80,000 votes. Hanson portrays this not as an accident, but as the result of concentrating on voters whom both parties had neglected. The chapter also argues that Barack Obama contributed to the division. Obama entered national politics with a celebrated speech rejecting the distinction between red and blue America. Hanson contends that his administration later governed in a more partisan and culturally progressive manner. Statements about rural voters clinging to guns and religion, presidential interventions in racially charged controversies, and the growing importance of identity politics convinced many working-class whites that the Democratic Party regarded them with suspicion or contempt. Hillary Clinton intensified this perception with her description of many Trump supporters as deplorable and irredeemable. Even though she also described another group as economically distressed and deserving empathy, Hanson argues that the distinction was itself patronizing. Millions of voters were classified either as morally defective or as confused people requiring re-education. Her language confirmed the Trump campaign's argument that cultural elites had stopped listening to the interior of the country. The split was reinforced by migration and economic specialization. People increasingly moved toward places that matched their political and cultural preferences. Immigrants, minorities, and socially liberal professionals tended to settle in large metropolitan regions and blue states. Conservatives and retirees often left high-tax, highly regulated coastal states for lower-cost red states. Primary elections became more ideological as each party's geographic base became more homogeneous. Economic change widened the separation. Globalization greatly increased the value of financial, technological, legal, academic, and cultural products developed on the coasts. Companies such as Amazon, Facebook, Google, and Microsoft could sell to a global market. Universities and financial centers became more influential and prosperous. At the same time, industrial and agricultural communities faced competition from countries with lower wages, fewer regulations, and rapidly expanding productive capacity. The resulting inequality was regional as well as individual. Incomes and property values increased dramatically in Washington, New York, the San Francisco Bay Area, and other globalized centers. Many communities in the interior experienced stagnant wages, factory closures, opioid addiction, declining populations, and reduced civic confidence. Hanson rejects explanations that blame these communities for failing to adapt. In his account, their economic base had been transferred abroad, while the beneficiaries of globalization treated the resulting distress as evidence of cultural backwardness. Trump's political achievement was to treat these voters as pivotal rather than obsolete. He did not depend exclusively on them. He still received the overwhelming majority of Republican votes, including business owners, professionals, suburban conservatives, and traditional party loyalists. But working-class voters without college degrees supplied the additional support needed to win states that previous Republican candidates had lost. Hanson emphasizes the difference between material assistance and social dignity. Progressive policies might offer subsidies, wage mandates, or public benefits, but these measures did not replace the pride associated with stable employment and community participation. Trump's promise was not primarily that government would compensate people for permanent decline. It was that jobs, production, bargaining power, and national importance could return. The Electoral College amplified this strategy. A machinist in Pennsylvania or a clerk in Ohio could be more electorally decisive than an additional Democratic voter in New York or California. Trump inverted the hierarchy of globalization. Coastal elites who dominated culture and commerce discovered that their concentrated votes could not by themselves select the president. The forgotten interior could still determine the national outcome. The chapter concludes that this social coalition needed a concrete agenda. Resentment alone would not have been sufficient. Trump had to connect cultural recognition with policies on trade, immigration, war, energy, regulation, and national sovereignty. These policies became the substance of Trumpism. Chapter 2. Trumpism. Trumpism, in Hanson's account, was not a fully developed ideology created by political theorists. It was a collection of neglected issues that Trump repeated with unusual consistency. Many had appeared before in right-wing populism, old democratic economic nationalism, the campaigns of Ross Perot, or the arguments of critics of globalization. Trump's contribution was to combine them, simplify them, and present them relentlessly. The first major theme was opposition to optional wars. Trump criticized both Republican and Democratic administrations for interventions that were expensive, indecisive, and disconnected from immediate American interests. He did not reject military force. He argued that the United States should fight only when objectives were clear and victory was attainable. His complaint that America no longer won wars referred to conflicts that continued for years, without decisive political outcomes. This position challenged the post-Cold War foreign policy consensus. Washington specialists tended to regard intervention as part of America's responsibility for maintaining international order. Trump evaluated commitments through a more transactional standard. Were allies contributing fairly? Was the United States safer? Could success be defined? Were foreign populations grateful for American sacrifices? If not, inherited policies had to be reconsidered. Trade was the second defining issue. Trump rejected the assumption that free trade was automatically beneficial regardless of reciprocity. He focused on persistent trade deficits, foreign subsidies, intellectual property theft, currency practices, and barriers to American products. By 2018, he was threatening tariffs against China and also against allies. Advisors could portray these threats as bargaining instruments, but Hanson stresses that Trump was willing to disrupt established arrangements in order to force renegotiation. Critics argued that trade deficits were manageable costs of the international system, that consumers benefited from inexpensive imports, and that tariffs risked retaliation. Trump's response was that the benefits and burdens were unevenly distributed. Financial and technological sectors prospered, while industrial workers lost bargaining power in factories. A national policy could not be justified solely by aggregate gains if particular regions and classes bore the losses indefinitely. Illegal immigration was the issue that first distinguished Trump most sharply. He argued that uncontrolled entry weakened the rule of law, reduced wages for less skilled workers, complicated assimilation, increased some public costs, and created security risks. He promised a wall on the southern border, stronger enforcement, and an end to the assumption that illegal residents would eventually produce legal status. This position produced opposition from Democrats, immigration advocates, and important Republican business constituencies. Construction, agriculture, hospitality, and other industries benefited from access to low-cost labor. Establishment Republicans often supported comprehensive immigration reform that combined enforcement with legalization. Trump described such compromises as amnesty and argued that policy should prioritize citizens and legal immigrants. Hanson presents the border wall as both practical and symbolic. It was a large construction project, suited to Trump's identity as a builder. It represented the recovery of national sovereignty and the ability of government to complete visible projects. Its significance extended beyond the Southwest because immigration policy affected wages and employment throughout the country. Trump also supported familiar conservative policies: tax reductions, energy development, deregulation, school choice, judicial appointments, and the use of federal land and resources. The Heritage Foundation later concluded that his administration had implemented a substantial proportion of its conservative recommendations. This record contradicted predictions that Trump would govern as the liberal figure he had sometimes been before entering Republican politics. At the same time, Trump was selective about social conservatism. He showed limited interest in reducing Social Security, reversing same-sex marriage, or making every cultural dispute central to his administration. His distinctive priorities remained war, trade, immigration, production, and national interest. These issues separated him from his Republican rivals more than conventional conservative positions did. The chapter ends with a question. Could another candidate have adopted the same program without Trump's personal defects? Hanson doubts it. Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, or another experienced politician might have repeated some policies, but the disruptive agenda required a candidate willing to disregard donors, specialists, and reputational constraints. Trumpism may have been conceptually separable from Trump, but politically the two were difficult to divide. Chapter 3. Modern-day presidential. Having described the electorate and the agenda, Hanson turns to Trump's personality. He argues that Trump's rise cannot be explained by issues alone. The vulgarity, aggression, vanity, humor, and theatricality that repelled many Americans also made his campaign possible. Trump the messenger did not merely carry Trumpism. He amplified it. Hanson uses the metaphor of chemotherapy. Some voters considered Trump toxic but believed the institutions he attacked were more dangerous. They did not want another polite Republican who would manage decline without confronting its causes. They accepted the damage associated with Trump because they thought a more conventional treatment had repeatedly failed. Trump supporters often interpreted his attacks as retaliation rather than initiation. In their view, the media, universities, government officials, technology companies, and political leaders had spent years stereotyping rural and working-class Americans as ignorant, racist, or obsolete. Trump's insults were therefore experienced as a counterattack on behalf of people who lacked access to national platforms. His style was unlike that of his rivals. He spoke in a distinctive New York accent, used simple vocabulary, repeated slogans, improvised, exaggerated, and employed nicknames to reduce opponents to a memorable weakness. His language did not resemble carefully tested political speech. It communicated that he was not governed by consultants and that he did not fear the institutions evaluating him. The attacks could be gratuitous and destructive. His dismissal of Senator John McCain's status as a war hero was especially crude. Trump said he preferred people who had not been captured, insulting a former prisoner of war who had endured years of torture in Vietnam. Remarks of this kind contributed to the large number of Republican primary voters who opposed Trump, and to the substantial share of general election voters who supported him despite holding an unfavorable opinion of him. Yet outrage also generated attention. Journalists treated every phrase, misspelling, and provocation as a major event. Trump understood that hostile coverage could still dominate the news cycle. His invitation for Russia to locate Clinton's missing emails, for example, simultaneously provoked the media, entertained supporters, highlighted Clinton's email controversy, and demonstrated that accusations of Russian sympathy would not intimidate him. The same pattern continued during his presidency. When Trump congratulated Vladimir Putin after a managed Russian election or questioned conventional policy toward Moscow, critics treated the act as evidence of collusion or disloyalty. Trump appeared to respond by becoming even more conspicuous in dealing with Russia. He refused to grant his opponents the power to define ordinary diplomacy as proof of guilt. Hanson also emphasizes Trump's ability to select insults that adhered to public perceptions. Labels such as crooked, low energy, little, or leaking converted complicated criticisms into repeated identities. The technique was indecorous, but effective. It forced opponents to fight on terrain chosen by Trump. The cost was real. Trump's aggression strengthened loyalty among supporters while alienating independents and many suburban voters. It made it difficult to distinguish substantive policy debates from personal feuds. The same style that proved authenticity to one group demonstrated unfitness to another. His personality both sustained and limited his political coalition. The chapter therefore presents an unresolved paradox. Trump's message might not have succeeded without his combativeness, but that combativeness prevented him from receiving broader credit for the agenda. The country had to decide whether his behavior was evidence of necessary resistance or unacceptable toxicity. Before that judgment could be settled, Hanson turns to the institutions and parties that had created the opening for such a candidate. Part 2. An establishment without answers. Chapter 4. Democratic Tribalism. Hanson begins the second part by arguing that Hillary Clinton's campaign depended too heavily on opposition to Trump's character. Democrats spent enormous sums presenting him as corrupt, dangerous, racist, sexually predatory, dishonest, and mentally unstable. The problem, in Hanson's view, was that campaigns built mainly around personal denunciation often fail when they do not offer a persuasive alternative account of the country. The chapter traces the Democratic Party's transformation through the Obama years. Barack Obama campaigned in 2008 as a unifying liberal rather than an explicit progressive. His rhetoric emphasized national reconciliation and allowed voters to interpret him as a pragmatic successor to Bill Clinton. Once in office, Hanson argues, Obama increasingly embraced identity politics, executive action, expanded government, environmental regulation, and cultural intervention in disputes involving race, policing, gender, and religion. This transformation did not necessarily reflect a durable left-wing majority. Obama's election occurred amid unusual conditions: public exhaustion with the Iraq War, the financial crisis, an unpopular Republican administration, and the appeal of a young and charismatic candidate. His personal victories concealed severe losses for the Democratic Party in Congress, governorships, state legislatures, and local offices. By the end of his presidency, Democrats held the White House, but were institutionally weaker across much of the country. Hanson argues that Obama's success encouraged progressives to confuse the popularity of one candidate with public acceptance of an entire ideological program. Concepts that originated in universities and activist communities moved into national politics. Discussions of privilege, identity, safe spaces, structural discrimination, and group representation became increasingly central. The Democratic coalition came to rely on a combination of affluent professionals, public sector institutions, minorities, immigrants, activists, and the poor. Hillary Clinton's 2016 campaign moved further left than her 2008 campaign. 8 years earlier, she had competed with Obama for white working-class voters and presented herself as a culturally moderate Democrat. In 2016, Bernie Sanders pressured her from the left, and she responded by adopting much of the progressive agenda rather than moving toward the political center after the primaries. Her campaign assumed that the coalition that elected Obama could be reproduced by substituting the prospect of the first woman president for the first black president. The slogan "I'm with her" emphasized Clinton's identity and historic candidacy. Hanson argues that it did not answer Trump's claims about trade, immigration, deindustrialization, national decline, and political corruption. Clinton offered continuity with Obama and opposition to Trump, but not an equivalent economic and cultural message to the middle class. The chapter interprets this as a form of tribal politics. Political legitimacy was increasingly associated with group identity rather than a common national interest. Candidates competed to represent racial, ethnic, gender, and cultural constituencies. People who resisted this framework could be classified as beneficiaries of privilege or defenders of an unjust past. The result was a politics that spoke intensely to activist groups, but often alienated voters who wanted to be addressed primarily as workers, citizens, parents, or members of local communities. Hanson also emphasizes the economic contradiction within modern progressivism. Democratic rhetoric condemned wealth and inequality, yet some of the party's strongest supporters were billionaires, technology executives, financiers, media personalities, university leaders, and celebrities. Environmental and immigration policies imposed costs that elites could absorb more easily than workers in energy, manufacturing, construction, and lower-skilled service jobs. The party claimed to defend the disadvantaged while treating important working-class concerns as morally suspect. Trump benefited from these contradictions. He could argue that open borders harmed citizens competing for wages, that environmental restrictions eliminated jobs in regions far from affluent cities, and that the progressive coalition was managed by wealthy people insulated from the consequences of their own policies. Hanson does not deny that Trump was also wealthy. The difference, in his interpretation, was that Trump attacked the preferences of his own economic class and promised to use government to protect national production. The Democratic reaction to defeat reinforced the problem. Rather than concluding that Clinton had moved too far from working-class voters, many party activists argued that she had not been progressive enough. Calls to abolish immigration enforcement, expand government health care, cancel student debt, and adopt more explicitly socialist policies became more common. Hanson sees this as a cycle in which each progressive position is rapidly replaced by a more radical one. By 2016, the Democratic Party had difficulty explaining how its policies would improve the lives of coal miners, factory workers, small business owners, or residents of declining towns. It could denounce Trump, but the denunciation did not resolve the conditions that made him attractive. The absence of a broad middle-class message left space for a candidate who could claim that national solidarity had been replaced by a coalition of tribes. Chapter 5. Republicans lose while winning. The Republican Party faced a different contradiction. During the Obama years, it achieved major victories in Congress, state governments, and local offices. Yet, it repeatedly struggled to win the presidency or the national popular vote. Its policies often retained broad support, but its candidates appeared cautious, managerial, and disconnected from the regions that determined close elections. Hanson describes the recent Republican presidential nominees as variations of the same establishment type. George H.W. Bush, Bob Dole, John McCain, and Mitt Romney were experienced, respectable, and conventionally qualified. They also appeared to many voters as wealthy or professional figures who accepted the basic framework of government expansion, free trade, military intervention, and immigration compromise. Conservative voters had accumulated a series of disappointments. George H.W. Bush broke his promise not to raise taxes. George W. Bush expanded federal spending, introduced new entitlements, and pursued costly wars. McCain supported intervention abroad and comprehensive immigration reform. Romney had governed Massachusetts in a manner that anticipated elements of the Affordable Care Act. The party asked its base to vote against Democrats while repeatedly offering candidates who seemed unwilling to reverse Democratic policies. The 2016 Republican field initially appeared unusually strong. It included governors with executive experience, senators with national profiles, candidates from minority backgrounds, and outsiders from business and medicine. Yet the size of the field divided the anti-Trump vote and created repeated opportunities for Trump to dominate debates and news coverage. Trump converted attacks into evidence for his own argument. When rivals criticized his donations to politicians, he replied that the politicians had willingly accepted the money and later served donors like him. When Marco Rubio mocked Trump for repeating a small number of slogans, the criticism demonstrated that Trump had a consistent and memorable message, while his opponents offered numerous disconnected policy points. When party leaders emphasized experience, Trump pointed to the failures produced by experienced leaders. His method was reductionist. If free trade benefited everyone, why did China protect its own industries? If NATO was indispensable, why did wealthy European countries spend less on defense than the United States? If illegal immigration was harmless, why did Mexico police its own southern border? If globalization produced prosperity, why were American factories closing while foreign factories opened? These questions simplified complicated subjects, but they exposed assumptions that establishment politicians had stopped defending. Hanson argues that the post-war international system had depended on American generosity. The United States tolerated trade deficits, financed military alliances, protected sea lanes, absorbed immigrants, and opened its market partly because it possessed unmatched wealth and power. By 2016, many voters no longer believed that this asymmetry was sustainable or fairly distributed. Republican leaders continued to defend the system without explaining why the same communities should indefinitely bear its costs. The party's concern with respectability also became a liability. Republican candidates often feared condemnation from media and cultural institutions. They moderated their language, apologized quickly, and avoided subjects that could be labeled insensitive. Trump treated elite disapproval as evidence that he was attacking the correct target. His willingness to continue after criticism made conventional Republicans appear weak. The chapter does not argue that Trump possessed a more coherent economic theory than his rivals. It argues that he recognized the political failure of their orthodoxy. He connected trade, immigration, foreign policy, and deindustrialization to a common accusation. The governing class had placed abstract global commitments above the interests of American citizens. Once Trump won the nomination, many Republican voters who had opposed him returned to the party. The Loud Never Trump movement represented influential intellectuals and officials, but relatively few election day defections. Trump received a share of Republican votes comparable to previous nominees, while adding crucial support from disaffected working-class voters. The remaining obstacle was larger than either party. Trump had promised to challenge the permanent government itself, the agencies, officials, contractors, lobbyists, experts, and institutions that remained in Washington regardless of election results. Hanson turns next to this administrative state, which he calls the swamp, or deep state. Chapter 6. The Anseen Regime. Hanson defines the administrative state as a permanent structure of power operating within and around constitutional government. It includes career officials in federal agencies, political appointees who move between administrations, intelligence and law enforcement institutions, think tanks, lobbying firms, universities, media organizations, contractors, and businesses with close relationships to Washington. Elections change presidents and legislators, but much of the system remains. The chapter opens with the anonymous New York Times essay published in September 2018 by a person described as a senior official in the Trump administration. The writer claimed that officials inside the government were resisting parts of Trump's agenda and frustrating presidential decisions. Hanson treats the essay as an extraordinary admission that unelected officials believed they had authority to overrule the elected president. The administrative state possessed two advantages over ordinary citizens. It commanded the resources of government, and it understood bureaucratic procedures better than outsiders did. Agencies could delay policies, interpret statutes, initiate investigations, leak information, and frame disputes through selective access to the press. A president unfamiliar with Washington could issue an order without understanding how officials might narrow, postpone, or redirect it. Trump was particularly vulnerable because he lacked a network of experienced loyalists. Traditional Republican presidents could recruit from established conservative institutions. Many of those institutions opposed Trump. Writers, officials, former cabinet members, and policy specialists who might normally advise a Republican administration joined the Never Trump movement. The exception was judicial appointments, where organizations such as the Federalist Society provided experienced candidates and institutional support. Hanson argues that senior figures in intelligence and law enforcement displayed open hostility toward Trump. Former officials such as John Brennan and James Clapper became television commentators and described the president in terms associated with treason, foreign control, or danger to the republic. Current and former bureaucrats suggested that officials had a duty to resist orders they considered improper. In Hanson's view, this doctrine allowed career employees to substitute their political judgment for constitutional authority. The chapter devotes substantial attention to the investigation of the 2016 campaign. Hanson portrays FBI Director James Comey as inconsistent and self-righteous. Comey reassured Trump that he was not personally under investigation, later leaked memoranda of private conversations, and acknowledged that he hoped the leak would lead to the appointment of a special counsel. The resulting special counsel was Robert Mueller, Comey's longtime professional associate. Hanson argues that the investigation of Trump relied heavily on the dossier prepared by former British intelligence officer Christopher Steele, whose work was funded indirectly by the Clinton campaign. He contends that the FBI used material from political opposition research in applications to surveil a Trump campaign associate while failing to disclose its origins adequately. These claims support the book's broader argument that institutions presented as neutral had become politically selective. The administrative state extended beyond government agencies. Silicon Valley companies possessed extraordinary control over communication, information, and political influence. Employees of major technology firms overwhelmingly supported Clinton. Platforms could shape what information users encountered, suspend speakers, and determine the reach of political messages. Their executives moved between corporate positions and Democratic administrations, while former Obama officials joined technology companies after public service. The media formed another component of the establishment. Hanson argues that journalism had become openly aligned with the resistance to Trump. Leaks from officials were amplified through newspapers and television networks, while former intelligence leaders received platforms to interpret events. The distinction between reporting political opposition and bureaucratic conflict became increasingly blurred. Trump responded by attacking the FBI, CIA, Justice Department, Internal Revenue Service, media, and technology companies. These attacks violated the convention that presidents publicly express confidence in national institutions. Hanson argues that the convention had become a shield against accountability. If institutions behaved politically, reverence for them could not be demanded merely because they were institutions. The chapter acknowledges that the administrative state was not literally a single conspiracy. Its employees held different views and performed essential functions. Hanson's claim is structural rather than absolute. A common culture of education, geography, professional interest, and political preference made the system sympathetic to Obama and hostile to Trump. Obama expanded regulatory authority. Trump promised to reduce it. Despite predictions that the system would remove or neutralize him, Trump remained in office through his first 2 years. He did not resign, was not impeached, was not indicted, and did not govern as the liberals some conservatives expected. For Hanson, the persistence of his administration demonstrated both the strength of the opposition and the limits of its predictions. The conflict with the Anseen regime clarifies why Trump supporters tolerated his attacks. They believe that ordinary politicians could not confront institutions capable of destroying careers through investigations, leaks, and coordinated criticism. Trump's wealth, celebrity, aggression, and refusal to apologize made him unusually resistant. The same qualities that made him dangerous also made him useful. Part 3. Trump Metaphysics. Chapter 7. Trump on Decline. The third part examines the ideas that gave emotional coherence to Trump's campaign. The first was national decline. Nearly every candidate claimed that the country faced problems, but Trump's message was unusually direct. America had once been great, was no longer great, and could become great again. This formulation combined pessimism and optimism. The pessimism identified lost industries, weak borders, ineffective wars, stagnant wages, damaged communities, and declining respect abroad. The optimism insisted that these conditions were not inevitable. The United States retained enormous resources, technological capacity, military strength, and productive talent. The problem was leadership and national will. Hanson distinguishes Trump's declinism from socialist criticism. Bernie Sanders argued that capitalism had produced excessive inequality and required redistribution. Trump argued that American capitalism had been detached from national loyalty. Companies and investors benefited from global markets, while workers and communities absorbed the losses. The solution was not to replace capitalism, but to reconnect it to national production, employment, and reciprocity. Trump also differed from conventional conservatives. Republicans often assumed that free markets would continuously expand the economic pie and eventually compensate losers. Trump treated some economic relationships as contests in which one country's manufacturing gains could accompany another's losses. He accused China, Mexico, and other states of pursuing their own interests, while American leaders defended rules that no longer protected American production. The author acknowledges the strong case against simple declinism. Americans were materially wealthier, healthier, safer, and more technologically capable than earlier generations. The United States led the world in many forms of research, innovation, software, finance, and higher education. Companies such as Apple, Google, Facebook, and Amazon demonstrated continuing national strength. Hanson's response is that aggregate prosperity concealed unequal experience. A prosperous professional in Palo Alto and a displaced worker in the industrial Midwest inhabited different economies. The existence of extraordinary wealth did not disprove decline in particular regions, industries, or forms of civic life. Trump's message resonated because it described losses that national statistics and elite commentary often minimized. Advisors such as Stephen Bannon and Stephen Miller helped give this instinctive message an ideological form. The country's elites, they argued, had prospered from globalization while abandoning the national community. The interior was not poor because America lacked wealth. It was poor because national policy had distributed opportunity unevenly and treated the winners' preferences as universal wisdom. Make America great again therefore promised restoration rather than revolution. It appealed to memory, stable jobs, industrial production, controlled borders, national confidence, and leaders who place citizens first. Critics interpreted this language as nostalgia for racial or social hierarchies. Hanson interprets it as a demand that the benefits of American power again reach the middle class. The chapter also defends the cultural tradition under attack by some progressive commentators. Hanson asks why immigrants had come to the United States if the country's past was defined only by oppression. He emphasizes constitutional government, individual rights, market capitalism, self-criticism, and equality under law as Western achievements capable of reforming their own failures. Trump's critics regarded his declinism as intellectually crude and morally dangerous. They saw nationalism as a cover for nativism, xenophobia, or racism. Hanson argues that they underestimated the appeal of a program that combined national pride with economic restoration. Trump did not tell voters that decline should be managed. He told them that it could be reversed. Chapter 8. Never Hillary. The second great element of Trump's appeal was negative. He was not Hillary Clinton. Hanson argues that Clinton was uniquely suited to cancel Trump's liabilities. Both candidates were old, wealthy, controversial, and unpopular. Each had accumulated scandals. The differences between them allowed voters to interpret Trump as the outsider and Clinton as the embodiment of the political system. Trump's business record included failed products, lawsuits, bankruptcies, and questionable ventures such as Trump University. Clinton's controversies involved public office, the private email server, the Clinton Foundation, the handling of Benghazi, political influence, and the family's accumulation of wealth through speeches and donations. Hanson argues that accusations of corruption lost force when delivered by a candidate whose own record appeared compromised. Clinton's campaign also lacked a strong positive theme beyond continuity, identity, and opposition to Trump. Her historic status as a potential first woman president could not reproduce Obama's coalition automatically. She was a familiar national figure after decades in public life, and familiarity had produced high, unfavorable ratings. The Democratic primary added further damage. Party institutions favored Clinton against Bernie Sanders, and leaked communications suggested that the process was not neutral. Clinton received a debate or town hall question in advance. These events reinforced Trump's description of politics as rigged. The email investigation created another contradiction. Bill Clinton met Attorney General Loretta Lynch privately on an airport tarmac while the Justice Department was considering the case. FBI Director Comey criticized Hillary Clinton's handling of classified information, but declined to recommend prosecution. To Trump voters, the sequence demonstrated that the powerful were judged by different standards. The chapter treats Clinton's wealth as politically important. The Clinton Foundation raised enormous sums, and the Clintons received exceptional speaking fees while Hillary held or pursued office. The Uranium One controversy, whatever its legal meaning, contributed to the perception that foreign donors and political access were intertwined. This weakened Clinton's attempts to present Trump's commercial conduct as uniquely corrupt. Her husband's sexual history also reduced the effectiveness of attacks on Trump's behavior toward women. Democratic defenses of Bill Clinton during the Monica Lewinsky scandal had lowered the moral standard they later tried to apply to Trump. Some Democratic politicians eventually reconsidered those defenses, but the reconsideration came after the election. Hanson describes Clinton as a form of scandal vaccination for Trump. Each accusation against him prompted a comparison with her record. Questions about Russian connections could be answered with references to the Steele dossier or donations associated with Russian interests. Questions about wealth and influence invited discussion of the Clinton Foundation. Questions about sexual behavior recalled Bill Clinton and Hillary's treatment of his accusers. After losing, Clinton continued to explain the defeat through external causes. Russian interference, sexism, the media, James Comey, voter prejudice, and the political backwardness of the states Trump carried. She repeatedly criticized the country while speaking abroad, and described successful regions as economically dynamic and outward-looking, in contrast to the places that voted for Trump. Hanson argues that this conduct confirmed the cultural divide responsible for her loss. Her continued public presence helped Trump. It reminded reluctant Trump voters of the alternative they had rejected. Her unfavorable ratings remained high, and speaking fees declined sharply after she no longer appeared likely to hold future office. Hanson interprets this as evidence that much of her influence had depended on political access rather than personal appeal. The chapter concludes that Clinton did not merely fail to stop Trump, her candidacy made his victory possible. A less compromised Democrat might have defeated him, while another Republican might have lost to a more effective Democratic nominee. The specific pairing of Trump and Clinton allowed voters to overlook defects that would otherwise have been decisive. Chapter 9. The New and Old Crude Messenger. Chapter 9 returns to the problem of character. Hanson summarizes the dilemma with a remark attributed to his son. He approved of almost everything Trump had done, and disapproved of almost everything Trump had said. The sentence captures the separation that many reluctant supporters tried to make between policy and personality. Progressive critics rejected that separation. In their interpretation, Trump's crude behavior and his political agenda were equally objectionable. His insults, exaggerations, treatment of women, attacks on minorities, and hostility toward institutions were not accidental defects attached to an otherwise acceptable program. They expressed the same authoritarian and reactionary impulses as the policies themselves. Never Trump conservatives reached a different conclusion. Many supported tax reductions, deregulation, conservative judges, energy development, border enforcement, and a stronger military. They nevertheless argued that character was central to conservatism. A movement that excused Trump's conduct for immediate policy gains would lose moral credibility and teach future politicians that results justified any behavior. Trump's core supporters often treated the distinction as artificial. The same disposition that produced vulgar tweets also produced the willingness to confront China, pressure NATO members, enforce immigration law, and attack the administrative state. A polite and disciplined messenger might abandon the message when elite criticism became intense. Trump's indifference to conventional standards was therefore a source of political reliability. Hanson evaluates the claim that Trump was uniquely crude by comparing him with earlier presidents. American political history included corruption, sexual misconduct, racism, deception, vindictiveness, and private vulgarity. Franklin Roosevelt concealed serious information about his health and personal life. John Kennedy's affairs and medical problems were protected by the press. Lyndon Johnson used obscene and intimidating language. Richard Nixon's private conversations were filled with prejudice and hostility. Bill Clinton's sexual behavior generated impeachment. The difference was partly technological and institutional. Earlier presidents operated before smartphones, social media, round-the-clock cable news, and immediate public access to private remarks. Journalists often protected presidents or treated their personal lives as irrelevant. Trump entered office when every sentence could be recorded, distributed, interpreted, and repeated within minutes. Hanson also argues that media hostility magnified the effect. Studies cited in the book found that television coverage of Trump was overwhelmingly negative. Reporters increasingly treated themselves as participants in a struggle to protect democratic institutions. This made it difficult to determine how much of Trump's image reflected his behavior and how much reflected an unprecedented intensity of scrutiny. The author does not deny Trump's responsibility. His lack of discipline prevented him from benefiting fully from economic growth and policy success. He repeatedly transformed favorable news into controversies about himself. Personal feuds distracted from legislative priorities. Exaggerations made accurate claims easier to dismiss. Attacks on allies created unnecessary enemies. The moral question, however, remains complicated when a president's private or rhetorical defects are compared with public outcomes. Hanson asks whether presidential morality should be evaluated mainly through personal virtue or through policies affecting hundreds of millions of people. A personally decent president can preside over failed wars, economic stagnation, or destructive legislation. A deeply flawed person can appoint capable officials and adopt effective policies. Foreign policy provides Hanson's central example. Germany maintained a large trade surplus with the United States, spent less than the agreed share of national income on defense, relied on American troops, and still expressed strong anti-American sentiment. Previous presidents raised these concerns diplomatically without changing behavior. Trump's public attacks were crude, but they forced the issue into negotiation. The same pattern applied to North Korea. Previous administrations relied on agreements, multilateral talks, sanctions, and strategic patience, while the regime developed nuclear weapons and missiles. Trump threatened extraordinary retaliation, insulted Kim Jong-un, and then pursued direct talks. His method was dangerous and theatrical, but it disrupted a policy that had failed to prevent proliferation. Trumpism, therefore, rejected taboo subjects. Alliances, trade agreements, intelligence agencies, immigration practices, and diplomatic conventions could all be questioned. Supporters tolerated the messenger as long as the disruptions produced results and did not create economic collapse or major war. The limit of their tolerance had not yet been reached by the end of 2018. Hanson concludes that Trump's crudity must be judged in context. It was partly personal, partly a product of modern media, partly retaliatory, and partly instrumental. The argument does not resolve whether he was a good man. It asks whether a conventional president could have produced the same policy changes. Part 4. The Ordeal, Triumph, and Ordeal of President Trump. Chapter 10. End Trump. The fourth part begins with the resistance that formed immediately after the election. Hanson argues that no modern president encountered such a rapid and sustained effort to delegitimize or remove him before taking office. Trump lost the popular vote by approximately 2.8 million votes, but won the Electoral College by 304 to 227. His opponents treated this constitutional victory as technically valid but morally suspect. Protests began during the transition and intensified around the inauguration. Some activists called for electors to reject their state results. Others promoted recounts, questioned Trump's mental competence, discussed impeachment before he entered office, or imagined assassination and military removal. Celebrities and public figures used violent language, that would have produced outrage if directed at previous presidents. Hanson attributes this reaction to several causes. Democrats expected Clinton to win and believed that Obama's progressive legacy was secure. Trump threatened to reverse that legacy quickly. He was personally provocative, unpredictable, and unwilling to seek reconciliation with defeated opponents. His victory also discredited the expertise of pollsters, journalists, consultants, and officials who had declared it nearly impossible. The resistance extended into government. Former Obama officials joined legal and political campaigns against Trump. California and other states challenged federal policies. Intelligence officials appeared on television and described him as dangerous or compromised. Leaks from the administration and investigative agencies supplied a continuous series of stories suggesting disorder, criminality, or foreign influence. Never Trump conservatives formed a parallel opposition. Former Republican officials, writers, senators, governors, and national security specialists argued that Clinton, a third-party candidate or abstention, was preferable to Trump. Some maintained their opposition after he adopted conservative policies. Their criticism gave the resistance bipartisan legitimacy and allowed media organizations to present attacks on Trump as defenses of traditional Republican principles. The conflict with Senator John McCain represented the bitterness of this division. Trump had insulted McCain's war record. McCain opposed important elements of Trump's agenda, helped bring the Steele dossier to federal attention, and cast the decisive vote against repealing the Affordable Care Act. His funeral in 2018 became, in Hanson's description, an implicit condemnation of the sitting president. The central institutional conflict concerned Russia. The Clinton campaign, through legal and research intermediaries, funded the work that produced the Steele dossier. The dossier contained allegations about Trump and Russian influence. The FBI used it as part of the justification for surveillance associated with the campaign. After the election, the allegations expanded into an investigation of whether Trump or his associates had coordinated with Russia. Hanson reverses the conventional interpretation. He argues that the more substantial collaboration with Russian sources occurred through Steele's research for the Clinton campaign. Russian individuals supplied claims that were used to damage Trump. The author contends that officials relied on this political material, leaked information, and obscured the dossier's origins. James Comey's conduct again occupies a major place. Comey briefed Trump on allegations, created memoranda of their conversations, and leaked one through a friend after being fired. He said his purpose was to encourage appointment of a special counsel. Robert Mueller was then selected to investigate Russian interference, possible coordination, and related offenses. Hanson portrays the Mueller investigation as prolonged and increasingly detached from its original purpose. It produced indictments and convictions involving false statements, financial crimes, or conduct unrelated to coordination with the Russian government. Through late 2018, Hanson argues, it had not established that Trump conspired with Russia to defeat Clinton. The chapter repeatedly uses the idea of projection. Trump's opponents accused him of collusion while relying on information collected from Russian sources. They accused him of politicizing law enforcement while senior officials displayed political hostility. They warned that he might reject an election result after some of them sought to overturn or delegitimize his victory. Hanson also argues that a Clinton victory would probably have concealed many of these events. The funding and use of the dossier, surveillance applications, informants, leaks, and internal communications would have received little scrutiny under an administration controlled by the winning party. Defeat transformed opposition research into a mechanism for weakening the incoming president. The author recognizes that Trump contributed to his own difficulties. His thin skin, repeated tweets, attacks on investigators, and inability to ignore criticism created the appearance of obstruction and panic. Even when accusations were weak, his reactions made them politically powerful. He repeatedly shifted attention from policy success to personal conflict. By the end of the chapter, Trump remained below majority approval in most polls, despite economic gains. Hanson attributes this partly to the resistance, the media, the special counsel investigation, and never Trump conservatives. He also attributes it to Trump's inability to control himself. The president's enemies often appeared extreme, but he rarely allowed their excesses to stand without producing an excess of his own. Chapter 11. Trump, the tragic hero? Hanson uses classical tragedy and the American Western to interpret the relationship between Trump's defects and his usefulness. The tragic hero is not necessarily virtuous, pleasant, or suited to ordinary civic life. He is often proud, violent, resentful, and difficult to control. Society turns to such a figure because normal institutions cannot defeat an extraordinary threat. Achilles is the principal classical comparison. He is the strongest Greek warrior, but he is also self-absorbed, obsessed with honor, loyal to his personal circle, and contemptuous of mediocre leaders. He withdraws when he believes his achievements are not recognized. Trump similarly complains that the press, political establishment, and members of his own administration refuse to give him credit. The comparison is not presented as praise of Trump's intellect or moral stature. It is a structural analogy. Achilles is useful because he can do what ordinary soldiers cannot. He is dangerous because the qualities that make him effective prevent him from accepting normal restraint. Trump's willingness to destroy conventions might be necessary to challenge the establishment, but the destruction could continue after its useful purpose had been served. Hanson also invokes Western films. A threatened town may need a gunslinger who lives outside its moral order. The outsider defeats the danger and restores security, but he cannot remain comfortably within the community he saves. His violence is both indispensable and incompatible with ordinary life. Trump's approach to personnel reflected this pre-civic style. Loyalty and personal chemistry often mattered more than stable procedures. Advisors and cabinet officials entered and left at high rates. Michael Flynn, Sean Spicer, Reince Priebus, Stephen Bannon, Gary Cohn, Rex Tillerson, and H.R. McMaster were among the prominent departures. Trump described turnover as energy and the search for talent. Critics described it as chaos. The administration's defenders often claimed to be the adults in the room, preventing the president from acting on impulsive ideas. Anonymous leaks in books portrayed aides removing documents, ignoring orders, and managing Trump without his knowledge. Hanson regards many of these accounts as exaggerated, self-serving, or unverifiable. He also acknowledges that the White House invited some of the disorder through poor hiring, internal competition, and indiscreet staff. The tension appeared clearly in foreign policy. Officials reportedly prepared instructions telling Trump not to congratulate Putin after the Russian election. The instructions leaked when Trump ignored them. The leak was intended to show that responsible advisors had tried to restrain an undisciplined president. It also demonstrated that officials were willing to disclose confidential advice in order to embarrass him. Despite turnover and controversy, the administration continued to function. Polling sometimes improved during periods of apparent chaos, particularly when the economy performed well or foreign policy initiatives appeared successful. Hanson therefore rejects the assumption that organizational disorder automatically produced policy failure. The tragic hero interpretation contains a warning. If Trump's disruption restored growth, deterrence, and public confidence, voters might eventually decide that the emergency had passed. Once the threat was reduced, the same behavior that had seemed necessary would become intolerable. The hero could be expelled precisely because he succeeded. Hanson suggests that many voters wanted a temporary figure rather than a permanent model of presidential conduct. They did not want a succession of Trump-like presidents. They wanted one outsider willing to confront institutions that ordinary politicians feared, after which a more stable political order might return. The chapter's qualified case for Trump is therefore temporal. His excesses might be justified by a specific historical moment, not by a general theory that presidents should be vulgar or chaotic. He is compared to a dangerous instrument selected for a difficult task. The final judgment depends on whether the task was real and whether the instrument produced more repair than damage. Chapter 12. Mr. Trump Goes to Washington. The final chapter evaluates the first 2 years of governance. Hanson asks 2 questions. Was the country better or worse than it had been in 2016, and how much responsibility did Trump deserve for the change? His answer is strongly favorable, especially regarding the economy, regulation, energy, judicial appointments, and foreign policy. Trump defined his administration as the opposite of Obama's. Where Obama expanded regulation and government management, Trump emphasized markets and deregulation. Where Obama supported the Iran nuclear agreement, the Paris Climate Accord, and a cautious approach toward North Korea, Trump withdrew, renegotiated, threatened, or imposed sanctions. Where Obama presented social change through refined language, Trump presented reversal through confrontation. The economic indicators available in 2018 supplied the core of Hanson's case. Annualized gross domestic product growth exceeded 3% and reached more than 4% in one quarter. Unemployment fell below 4%, reaching levels not seen in many years. Minority unemployment also declined, equity markets rose, business confidence improved, and energy production expanded. Hanson rejects the argument that Trump merely inherited the Obama recovery. He acknowledges that presidents do not control the entire economy, and that expansions develop over time. He nevertheless points to clear policy changes, corporate and individual tax reductions, accelerated depreciation, removal of regulations, expanded access to oil and gas development, changes at the Environmental Protection Agency and Interior Department, and a rhetorical commitment to production. The administration claimed hundreds of deregulatory actions. Supporters argued that removing compliance costs encouraged investment, hiring, and energy development. Critics warned that environmental protection, worker safety, consumer interests, and fiscal stability were being sacrificed. Hanson sides with the supporters, emphasizing immediate employment and growth. Foreign policy is assessed through deterrence and burden sharing. Trump pressured NATO members to increase defense spending. He challenged Germany over both military contributions and trade surpluses. He treated alliances as reciprocal arrangements rather than unconditional guarantees. Critics worried that public pressure weakened trust among allies. Hanson argues that private diplomatic requests had failed and that the alliances would become stronger if members carried more of the cost. Toward China, Trump connected trade and security. He threatened tariffs, challenged intellectual property practices, and warned that the existing economic relationship could not continue. China also had influence over North Korea. By creating uncertainty about trade and regional nuclear proliferation, Trump increased the cost of Beijing of tolerating North Korean threats. The North Korean confrontation moved from insults and threats to direct diplomacy. Trump warned that continued nuclear escalation could produce overwhelming retaliation, then met Kim Jong-un. Hanson does not claim that denuclearization had been achieved. He argues that the previous policy had allowed the threat to grow, and that disruption created at least the possibility of a different outcome. Trump also appointed conservative judges and Supreme Court justices, strengthened immigration enforcement, withdrew from international agreements he considered unfavorable, and supported military rebuilding. His administration implemented many objectives long advocated by conservative organizations. This record weakened the never-Trump claim that he would govern incoherently or as a disguised liberal. Legislative success was limited by narrow congressional majorities and Republican dissent. Senators such as John McCain, Jeff Flake, Bob Corker, and Rand Paul did not consistently support the administration. Repeal of the Affordable Care Act failed. Trump's conflicts with congressional leaders reduced the unity needed to pass major legislation. Hanson also considers the possibility of expanding Trump's coalition. Economic growth, immigration enforcement, and job creation could appeal to Black and Latino voters on the basis of class rather than identity. Trump argued that illegal immigration created competition for less skilled citizens, and that deregulation and tax reductions produced opportunities in communities long dependent on government assistance. Early polling suggested some increase in minority support, though the book does not claim a durable realignment had already occurred. The chapter distinguishes successful destruction from successful construction. Trump demonstrated that the old establishment was vulnerable, and that many of its predictions were wrong. Low unemployment, faster growth, energy expansion, and pressure on allies contradicted claims that his policies would immediately produce recession or war. But breaking conventional wisdom was easier than building a stable replacement. The future of the presidency would depend on whether Trump could institutionalize his changes. Temporary tax cuts, executive orders, tariffs, personal diplomacy, and confrontational rhetoric could be reversed. A lasting political movement required legislation, administrative competence, public support, and successors capable of translating Trumpism into a more durable form. By the end of 2018, the national division remained. One half of the country experienced Trump as liberation from a failed establishment. The other experienced him as a daily threat to political norms. Hanson argues that the record of governance, rather than the intensity of the rhetoric, should determine the final judgment. Yet he acknowledges that Trump's rhetoric continually shaped how the record was perceived. Part 5. Epilogue. Epilogue. Trump trudges on. The 2018 midterms and beyond. The Epilogue evaluates the 2018 midterm elections and asks whether they change the argument of the book. The country remained divided along the same geographic and cultural lines. Affluent coastal professionals, minorities, activists, and many educated suburban voters aligned with the Democratic Party. Rural communities, small towns, working-class regions, and many suburban conservatives remained Republican. Trump had not significantly broadened his appeal. He continued to struggle with independents and suburban women. At the same time, his core supporters remained intensely loyal. The map of congressional districts still resembled the 2016 presidential map. Extensive Republican territory across the interior, balanced by densely populated Democratic metropolitan regions and coastal corridors. Many commentators predicted a blue wave comparable to the severe congressional losses suffered by Bill Clinton in 1994 or Barack Obama in 2010. Democratic candidates and political organizations raised approximately $1 billion for state and federal races. Opposition to Trump produced high turnout, extensive media support, and strong motivation. The actual result was mixed. Republicans lost control of the House after losing roughly 30 seats, a result somewhat worse than the historical average for a president's first midterm, but far smaller than the losses under Clinton or Obama. Republicans gained Senate seats, benefiting from contests in states Trump had carried. Hanson interprets this as a normal midterm correction rather than a decisive repudiation of Trumpism. Control of the House gave Democrats the ability to investigate the administration, issue subpoenas, obstruct legislation, and begin impeachment proceedings. Trump would have to rely more heavily on executive action or compromise with a party whose activist base demanded confrontation. Hanson argues that progressive candidates performed less successfully in statewide contests than moderate Democrats did in suburban House districts. Candidates associated with abolishing immigration enforcement, government-run health care, debt cancellation, and immediate impeachment often lost competitive races. Centrist Democrats, including candidates with military backgrounds, captured districts by distancing themselves from the party's most radical rhetoric. Economic conditions remained favorable. Growth during the third quarter of 2018 continued at an annualized rate above 3%, and the number of people receiving unemployment benefits fell to a level not seen since the early 1970s, despite a much larger population. The strength of the economy helped Republican candidates and prevented the election from becoming a complete rejection of the president. Prosperity produced another paradox. As economic anxiety declined, voters could focus more heavily on Trump's personality, cultural conflict, and social issues. Policy success did not necessarily improve his likability. His job approval ratings could approach those of previous presidents at comparable moments, while personal evaluations remained substantially worse. The Mueller investigation continued into its 76th week without, in Hanson's assessment, establishing the original allegation that Trump coordinated with Russia to defeat Clinton. Democrats hoped the final report would support impeachment. Trump supporters viewed the investigation as further evidence of institutional resistance. Neither side moderated. Trump continued daily conflicts on social media with politicians, celebrities, journalists, and former intelligence officials. His opponents used language of treason, fascism, violence, and moral emergency. Each side treated the other as a threat to the political order, making compromise appear equivalent to surrender. The epilogue ends without resolving the Trump paradox. The establishment repeatedly predicted his collapse, yet each controversy seemed to strengthen his bond with supporters. His administration produced results Hanson considered impressive, but the president remained personally unpopular. His opponents gained the House, but failed to produce the overwhelming national repudiation they expected. The book's final judgment is therefore conditional. Trump arose because important institutions had lost legitimacy, and because neither party addressed the economic and cultural grievances of the middle class. His aggressive personality allowed him to confront those institutions, but it also limited his coalition and threatened the durability of his achievements. Hanson's case for Trump is not that he represented an ideal president. It is that the country's circumstances made an abnormal president understandable and perhaps necessary. Trump exposed the weakness of political experts, challenged assumptions that had become insulated from results, and gave political power to voters who believed they had been discarded by globalization and progressive culture. Whether Trumpism would endure depended on questions the book could not answer in 2019. Could economic nationalism survive without Trump's personality? Could Republicans retain working-class voters while preserving traditional conservative support? Could Democrats return to a broad middle-class message rather than intensify identity politics? Could the administrative state regain trust? And could a future president preserve Trump's disruptions without reproducing his chaos? The case for Trump closes by asking readers to judge the phenomenon through both cause and consequence. Trump's defects were visible before the election and remain visible in office. The surprise was not that he behaved as he always had. The surprise was that the political system had created conditions in which millions of voters considered that behavior a tolerable price for change.